Tonight, we unlock a truth that was never meant to be revealed. A former priest, once sworn to secrecy, steps forward with more than just theory. He offers his testimony. What he exposes could shatter everything we've been taught. Hidden vaults, secret manuscripts, and a timeline carefully concealed by those who hold power over history. For years, he walked the hallowed halls of the Vatican, witnessing archives and forbidden knowledge that most will never see. He read the texts that were meant to stay buried. This is no mere tale of ancient rituals or forgotten scriptures. It's a story of control over time, knowledge, and memory itself. Centuries were crafted in silence, while the world bowed before the altar of Rome. But now, for the very first time, someone from within is pulling back the veil. This is not about whispers or rumors. It's the full, unfiltered truth, hidden for centuries and now revealed. And once you hear what he knows, there is no turning back. They say the church never forgets, that once the collar is worn, it marks you for life. But what they never tell you is what happens when that collar starts to strangle you. I was once inside, walking the ancient halls, praying in Latin, believing with every fiber of my being. But truth has a way of creeping into the cracks. And once it enters, it stays forever. If you like my channel, like and subscribe, because this journey into hidden history is just beginning. Don't miss what's coming next. I didn't leave the church because I lost faith in God. I left because I uncovered what was being hidden in His name. Deep within the Vatican, there are rooms that most priests will never enter. Corridors beneath corridors. Keys given to only a select few. And I was one of them. At first, it felt like a privilege, an honor bestowed for loyalty. But the deeper I ventured, the more the light faded, until all that remained were questions no one was willing to answer. One night I remember vividly. A storm had swept through Rome, and the power flickered. I was called to a section of the archives that most people don't even know exists. No photos, no phones, just the crushing silence, the dust, and a smell like dried blood on ancient parchment. What I found there were scrolls older than anything I'd ever studied. Texts written in languages I couldn't understand, yet somehow knew. They weren't just history, they told a different story of creation, of time, of us. It was in that dark, forgotten chamber that I first encountered the Vatican's forbidden secrets. That night, something changed within me. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing a stranger staring back. The truth I uncovered would haunt me forever. That night, I knew what I had been preaching wasn't history at all. It wasn't even a half-truth. It was a performance carefully orchestrated. And we, all of us, were just actors, reading from a script that had been written long before any of us were born. I kept quiet for months. I went through the motions. I led Mass, offered confessions, and smiled in the presence of bishops who, behind their calm eyes, held secrets that weighed heavily on their souls. But inside, I was crumbling. The lies weren't just in the texts. They were woven into the very silence that surrounded us. I had seen the Vatican's forbidden secrets, and with every passing day, it became harder to ignore the truth hidden in the shadows of those ancient walls. The story we had been told, the one we all believed, was only a fraction of the reality. And it was a lie I could no longer live with. In the pages we were told never to read, in the names erased from the records, in the years that simply vanished, I found the truth buried deep beneath layers of deception. Eventually, I walked away. No ceremony, No goodbye. I left my collar on the altar and stepped into the darkness of the night, a weight lifting from my shoulders, but a burden still pressing on my soul. Since then, I've kept my head low, living in silence. But I can't stay quiet any longer. There are truths the world must hear. Not to destroy faith, but to rebuild it on something real. Not on fear. Not on control. Truth. This is my confession. Not the kind whispered behind closed doors, in the shadows of a darkened booth, but the kind shouted beneath open skies, where it can no longer be hidden. Because sometimes the biggest sins are not committed by individuals. They are embedded in systems. Systems protected by robes, sanctified by rituals, and hidden behind gold and stone. If you think you know the Vatican, think again. What I saw was never meant to be seen. What I read was never meant to be remembered. Until now, the monastery was always quiet. Too quiet, but the silence, now, speaks louder than any prayer ever could. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, but watchful, like the walls themselves were listening. When I first arrived as a young seminarian, I thought it was holy, a place where questions would meet answers and doubt would fade into faith. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized that silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. We were taught how to read scripture, but only in a certain way. If you asked too many questions, even kind ones, the older priests would smile politely and change the subject. If you kept pressing, they would recommend prayer and fasting. That was their code. It meant stop asking. Some texts were studied in great detail. Others were mentioned once and never brought up again. And some names you only heard in whispers late at night when the lights were out and someone dared to speak freely. There was one class on early Christian history that changed everything for me. The priest leading it was careful, always reading directly from his approved notes. But during one lecture, he accidentally mentioned a gospel I had never heard of. The Gospel of Thomas. He paused immediately, looked up at the room, and then said, "Forget that. It was not part of the canon." He moved on. But I couldn't forget. I asked him about it later, just the two of us. He gave me a long look, and in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "Some books were left out for good reason." Then he walked away. That night, I went to the small monastery library. The lights were dim, and most of the books were locked behind glass. The ones we could access were all the same. Translations approved by the Church. Doctrinal summaries, saints' biographies. But I started noticing what wasn't there. No original texts. No opposing ideas. No room for interpretation. Just carefully chosen knowledge, repeated over and over until it became fact. We weren't just learning scripture. We were learning how to think a certain way, or more accurately, how not to think beyond the boundaries they set. It was subtle. No one ever said, "Stop thinking." They just steered you back on course every time you strayed. And over time, most of the students accepted it. They nodded. They recited. They passed the tests. They called it faith. But a few of us whispered, in the garden, after evening prayer, in the library corners. We spoke of the books we weren't allowed to read, of questions that didn't have answers. We started to wonder if we were here to find the truth or to forget it. In the monastery, truth wasn't denied. It was filtered. We were taught not to lie, but to never stray from the script. And in that silence, something ancient stirred, not faith, but the feeling that somewhere out there, buried under layers of ritual and reverence. The real story was still waiting to be found. It was never marked on any map. No hallway sign. No mention in the catalog. But everyone in the Vatican knew it was there. They just didn't speak of it, like a ghost room built into the stone long ago, hidden in plain sight. I found it by mistake. I had been assigned to assist an archivist deep in the Vatican library. Most of the work was boring, cataloging Latin manuscripts, dusting off ancient scrolls, copying inventory lists. But the deeper you went into the building, the more the air changed. Colder, heavier, like time slowed down the farther you stepped from the sunlight. That day, I was wheeling a cart of books down one of the basement corridors, when I noticed a side passage I had never seen before. It didn't look special. Just a plain stone arch with a faded wooden door at the end. But the light above it was on. That was odd. No one had ever told me to go that way, and the deeper areas were usually locked. I should have ignored it. I should have turned around. But something pulled me forward. The door was slightly open. I pushed it gently. It didn't creak. It just opened. Inside was a narrow stairwell lit by flickering bulbs. No guards, no cameras, just silence. At the bottom was a thick door made of iron and wood. It had no handle, but it wasn't locked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It wasn't like the rest of the library. There were no neat shelves or labeled rows. No signs pointing to scripture or saints. This room was chaotic. Scrolls stacked in piles. Books without titles. Manuscripts written in languages I didn't recognize. Some weren't even stored properly. They were laid out on tables like they'd just been read and abandoned. And the smell, not just dust. It smelled like age itself, like things left untouched for centuries. One parchment caught my eye. It was covered in symbols I had never seen. Circular patterns. Star charts. Notes scribbled in Latin, Greek, and something else. Something older. The words weren't just telling a story. They were warning someone. I felt it deep in my chest. Like whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be read casually. I didn't hear the door open behind me, but suddenly I wasn't alone. A figure stepped into the room. An older priest. He didn't yell. He didn't look surprised. He just stared at me for a long time. Then he said one thing. You were not meant to see this. He didn't explain. He didn't threaten me. He just walked over, took the manuscript from my hands, and gestured for me to leave. I never spoke of it again. Not to anyone. But from that moment on, I knew. The Vatican doesn't just guard history. It edits it, curates it, and sometimes it buries it so deep that even those who serve inside its walls forget what they're protecting or why. It started with a footnote, a tiny line in a massive theological commentary we were assigned to read during training. It mentioned a verse that didn't appear in our version of the Bible. At first, I thought it was a printing error. But then I noticed something strange. That verse existed, just not in our translation, and not in any version the church allowed us to use. That tiny discovery became an itch I couldn't stop scratching. I began comparing Bibles, the Latin Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, the Coptic versions, even early Syriac fragments. And slowly a pattern began to emerge. Certain stories changed tone. Certain names disappeared. Entire passages were shortened or reworded. Some texts had warnings. Others had endings that felt incomplete, like someone had carefully trimmed the edges so the whole thing would fit inside a box. There was one night I'll never forget. I had managed to get my hands on a copy of the Gospel of Thomas. Not through official channels. It had been scanned from a crumbling manuscript found in Egypt and translated by independent scholars. It was raw. It didn't tell the story of Jesus like the others did. There were no miracles, no resurrection, just sayings. Deep, mysterious, challenging. And what struck me most was how it painted a completely different picture. Not a savior from above, but a teacher of inner truth. A man telling people to look within, not to follow blindly. I brought it to a senior priest I trusted. He didn't even open it. He just looked at the cover and told me it was heretical, dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it wasn't meant for public eyes. He told me the church had made a decision long ago to protect the faithful. To keep the message clean and simple. He said the early councils decided what was holy and what was not. What was inspired and what was inconvenient. That word stayed with me. Inconvenient. Not untrue. Not evil. Just something that didn't fit. I started digging deeper. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. The Book of Enoch. The Gospel of Philip. All of them are real. All of them were excluded. Some hinted at divine feminine energy. Others talked about the stars and cycles of time. Some challenged the idea of sin itself, and every one of them had been hidden away, not destroyed, just buried, kept behind walls, or rewritten in languages no one could read without permission. It became clear that the Bible as we know it is not a perfect record. It's a curated collection, chosen by men, edited over centuries, translated in ways that served a purpose. To guide faith, yes, but also to shape power. When people say the Bible is the Word of God, they don't realize how many human hands touched it first. How many voices were silenced. How many truths were filed away under the label of heresy? And maybe the scariest part isn't that pages are missing. It's that we were never supposed to know they were gone. It was supposed to be a normal lesson. Just another dry lecture on church calendars and holy days. But something didn't sit right. We were being taught how Easter is calculated. It's based on the first full moon after the spring equinox. Simple enough. Until one student raised his hand and asked a question no one had ever dared ask before. What if the stars don't line up with those dates anymore? The room went quiet. The priest teaching us smiled, but didn't answer right away. He shifted in his chair. Then he muttered something about tradition and authority. That was the first red flag. If the church claims to follow the heavens, then why were we ignoring what the sky actually shows? That night I stayed behind in the library. I found an old almanac and started comparing dates. The more I looked, the more confused I got. According to astronomy, the spring equinox had drifted slowly, quietly over centuries. What used to happen in Aries now happens in Pisces. And yet the church still claimed everything was perfectly aligned. It wasn't. Not even close. I dug deeper. The calendar we use today, the Gregorian one, was created in 1582. Before that, we used the Julian calendar. But even that wasn't the original system. Civilizations long before the church had mapped the stars with shocking accuracy. They tracked solstices and lunar cycles with stone and shadow. They knew when the sky shifted, and they adjusted. But the church didn't. It declared time. It named the days. It chose which festivals would fall when. And slowly reality drifted away from ritual. One of the strangest discoveries was that Christmas doesn't fall anywhere near the actual date of Jesus' birth. It was chosen to replace older, pagan celebrations of the winter solstice, Easter too. It mirrored spring fertility rites that came long before the cross. Even the week itself was restructured to match biblical rhythm, rather than the cosmos. And maybe that would all be fine if the church admitted it. But instead, they taught it as absolute as divine timing, as if God himself drew the calendar with perfect hands. I started wondering, if time itself had been rewritten, what else had been? What else had been adjusted to fit the narrative? Some say it doesn't matter. Those dates are just symbols, that the meaning is more important than the accuracy. But when the stars above you no longer match the story you're told, something breaks. A crack forms, and through that crack questions flood in. If the church could reshape time, what was stopping it from reshaping history, or memory, or even the truth? That night, I walked outside and looked up. The sky was clear. Stars blinked above me like quiet witnesses. They didn't care what date we called it. They told a different story. One carved in light and silence. One the church tried to imitate but never quite matched. And in that space between heaven and habit, I realized the stars were right. We were the ones who had gone wrong. There's a hallway deep inside the Vatican that few people ever walk. No tourists, no cameras, just silence and rows of filing cabinets stretching longer than they should. I was helping an older archivist organize documents one afternoon when he stepped out to take a phone call. I was told to stay in one room, but curiosity doesn't listen to orders. I wandered a little, just a few steps. That's when I saw the drawer. It wasn't locked. I pulled it open and found files labeled with saint names I'd never heard before. Saint Manalphas, Saint Labrada, Saint Sicarius of Bronto. They were typed out in neat Vatican script, but something felt off. I flipped through the pages. Most of them didn't have birth dates. Some didn't even have locations. Just short descriptions of miracles, visions, martyrdoms, stories that sounded more like myths than real lives. One folder simply said, "No longer recognized." That phrase chilled me. It was like someone had quietly erased them, not with fire or violence, but with paperwork. When the archivist returned, I asked him casually about one of the saints. He stared at me for a moment, then smiled and said, "Not all saints stay saints. Sometimes stories fall apart. Sometimes evidence goes missing or never existed at all." That answer haunted me. I started looking deeper into the official canon. The recognized saints. Thousands of names. But when I tried to trace some of their lives, I found dead ends. Churches dedicated to people who might never have lived. Statues of saints with no historical records. Miracles are attributed to names that first appeared in documents centuries after they supposedly died. At first, I thought maybe it was just poor record keeping. Ancient history is messy. But then I found internal memos from the 1960s. During a massive review called the Reform of Roman Martyrology, dozens of saints were quietly removed or demoted. Some were labeled as pious legends. Others were suspected to be fictional. The church never announced it loudly. It just happened. That's when it hit me. Sainthood wasn't just about faith. It was also about control. Stories of saints were used to teach lessons, to inspire fear, to shape behavior. And if those stories needed to be rewritten or removed to fit the narrative, they were. But what about the people who prayed to them for generations? The villages built around their relics? The children named after them? What happens when your protector is declared imaginary? It made me wonder how many other names had been created or erased without anyone knowing. How much of our history was based on figures that only existed on parchment and in sermons. The church didn't need to burn books when it could just close the file and move on. And sometimes the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that get told. They're the ones that disappear quietly, with no one left to ask why. That day I realized the saints weren't just holy. They were edited. And in the margins of those edits, a different history was hiding. The first time I saw the chained books, I thought it was just for preservation. Old leather bindings, heavy iron clasps, thick chains bolted to stone desks. But then I noticed something strange. These weren't books people were supposed to read. They were books meant to stay put, to stay closed. And the language inside them wasn't meant for just anyone. It was Latin, but not the kind we learned in seminary. This Latin was older, twisted, almost like it had been rewritten to hide more than it revealed. There was one manuscript I remember clearly. It looked like a collection of parables at first, but the phrasing was dense, overcomplicated. Instead of saying God is light, it said something like, divine luminosity is expressed through metaphysical emanation. That sounds smart, but it's designed to confuse, to make the meaning so difficult that only trained priests could understand it, or think they could. I asked my mentor why the church didn't just translate everything into common language. His answer was simple. Not everyone can handle the truth. He said it with a straight face, as if protecting the faithful from knowledge was holy, as if truth needed a filter. That's when I started noticing the pattern. Ancient texts would be found in Greek or Aramaic. Clear, powerful, sometimes even poetic. But when they were copied into Latin, everything changed. Meanings shifted. Words were added. Some parts were left out completely, and the Latin versions became the official ones. The ones taught, preached, canonized. It wasn't just a translation. It was a transformation. One day I found an early version of a gospel side by side with its Latin counterpart. The original said, "The kingdom of God is within you." The Latin version rephrased it. "The kingdom of God is not for all to understand." That one change flips the entire meaning. One empowers, the other controls. I began to see that the real power of the church wasn't in the buildings or the gold. It was in the words we were allowed to hear, and the ones that were buried in layers of language and ritual. In the early centuries, there were hundreds of Christian texts, letters, visions, teachings. Not all agreed with each other. Some spoke of reincarnation, others of stars and cycles. Some even hinted at technology far beyond their time. But the church chose which ones to translate, which ones to elevate, and which ones to lock away in chains. The deeper I went into those archives, the more I realized that language itself had become a gatekeeper, a way to keep the masses obedient. If you can't read the rules, you can't question them. It's not that the truth was destroyed. It was encoded, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in Latin few could read, and even fewer could truly understand. And those chains weren't just metal. They were silent, they were afraid, and they were obedience disguised as reverence. They taught us that the Dark Ages were just a time when everything fell apart. After Rome collapsed, the world forgot how to think, how to build, how to dream. People stopped reading. Science vanished. Progress hit pause. But what if that story isn't true? What if it wasn't just darkness by accident? What if it was darkness by design? That idea hit me late one night while reading an old lecture transcript buried deep in the Vatican archive. It wasn't even classified, just forgotten. The professor had argued that the early Middle Ages weren't as primitive as we're told. He said people didn't just lose knowledge. They were kept from it. At first, I thought he was exaggerating. But then I looked into the records and the gaps were huge. For almost 300 years, we have almost no original writings. No confirmed inventions. No clear history. As if time just dimmed. That's when I found the theory no one likes to talk about. The phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that entire centuries may have been added or erased from history. That kings and popes worked together to rewrite timelines, to hide things, or to give themselves more power. It sounds crazy until you realize how much of our calendar was set by popes. How many dates were changed without evidence? How many documents we rely on are copies of copies of copies? But even if time wasn't faked the way that theory claims, one thing is clear. The Church controlled what survived. Books that challenged doctrine were burned. Scientists who questioned too much were silenced. Whole libraries were wiped out in the name of purification. And the few places that still held ancient knowledge were turned into monasteries where only monks could read. The average person wasn't allowed to own scripture, or to study astronomy, or to ask where certain ideas even came from. Knowledge became a privilege, and ignorance became holiness. Some inventions we think were created in the Renaissance had already existed centuries before, but they were forgotten or buried. Glass lenses, advanced maps, mechanical devices, all gone. And then suddenly rediscovered as if they appeared from nowhere. But they didn't. They had been suppressed, hidden in vaults, or destroyed to keep control. The more I read, the more I realized that the so-called Dark Ages weren't dark because of chaos. They were dark because someone dimmed the lights. When truth threatens power, it becomes dangerous. And in those centuries, when the Church was growing stronger than any king or emperor, it decided what was sacred and what was sin, what was remembered and what was erased. It wasn't a time without knowledge. It was a time without access. And that's the real danger of forgetting. Not that things are lost, but they are hidden on purpose in the name of order. And once you see that pattern, it's hard to unsee it, because then you start to wonder how much of what we call history was actually memory rewritten. They told us the Jesuits were scholars, missionaries, men of learning and discipline. They dressed simply, spoke softly, and always acted as if they served a higher cause. But behind the public image was something far more secretive, something most priests never learned. Something I only heard about after I had already taken my own vows. The Society of Jesus was founded in the 1500s. And from the beginning it was different. Jesuits weren't just priests, they were soldiers, trained in obedience, strategic thinking, and absolute loyalty. We all knew about their basic vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But whispered among the older clergy was a fourth vow, one you don't read about in catechism books, one only taken by a few and only behind closed doors. The fourth vow is simple in words, but massive in meaning. It is a vow of obedience directly to the Pope, not just in spiritual matters, but in missions, in politics, in silence. Those who take it promise to go wherever the Pope sends them, to do whatever is asked, no questions, no hesitation. And the things they're asked to do rarely show up in the history books. I spoke once with a Jesuit who had served in multiple countries, always under different names. He said his work was spiritual, but when I pressed him, he gave a strange smile and said, "Spiritual warfare takes many forms." Then he looked away like he had already said too much. The Jesuit chain of command doesn't end with the Pope. It runs through the superior general, the man they call the Black Pope. Not because of his skin, but because of his robes, his title, his influence. While the Pope stands in the light blessing crowds and waving from balconies, the Black Pope operates in shadows. Few people know his name, fewer still understand his power. He commands thousands of Jesuits across the globe, their schools, their missions, their networks. And while they preach discipline and devotion, they also gather intelligence. They influence politics. They sit in rooms where laws are written and wars are planned. Always quiet, always present. The fourth vow binds them not just to God, but to an invisible hierarchy of control. And once you take it, there is no turning back. You don't speak of what you do. You don't question your orders. You move like a ghost through the systems of the world, leaving no trace. And if you disobey, you disappear. Some say this is all legend, that the Jesuits are just educators and servants of faith. But I have seen the documents. I have read the unspoken codes. I have met men who were never introduced by their real names. The Church hides many things, but the Jesuits don't just guard the secrets, they enforce them. And the fourth vow is the lock that keeps it all in place. Not all soldiers wear armor, and not all wars are fought with swords. Some are waged in silence, in ink, in whispers, in loyalty so deep it becomes invisible. There's a room buried beneath Vatican City that almost no one talks about. No stained glass, no gold trim, just cold stone walls and thick wooden doors. They don't call it a courtroom, they call it a tribunal. But it's not like any court you've ever seen. There's no jury, no crowd, just a table, a chair, and a handful of men in black robes who ask the questions and decide what happens next. I was only there once, as an observer, a quiet guest to something ancient and hidden. They called it a doctrinal review, but the name was just smoke. What it really was a trial. Not for criminals, but for thinkers, for questioners, for those who dared to suggest that the world might be different than the Church claimed. The man being questioned was a priest, older, thin, with soft eyes. His only crime was writing a paper, suggesting that the book of Genesis might be a metaphor. That creation could have happened in waves over eons. That science and faith didn't have to fight. He didn't preach this. He didn't publish it. He only shared it with a group of fellow scholars, and one of them had reported him. The questions were sharp, precise, designed to trap. Did he believe the Bible was literal truth? Did he deny the divine creation of man? Did he submit to the authority of the Church's teaching on the origin of life? He answered carefully, respectfully. But it didn't matter. The room had already made up its mind. He was found guilty of doctrinal deviation, not heresy. They don't use that word much anymore. But the punishment felt the same. He was silenced, forbidden to teach. His notes were confiscated. His reputation was quietly erased. No fire, no chains, just quiet removal. And no one would hear from him again. Later, I found the old heresy files, locked away in a cabinet labeled with faded Latin. Names I recognized. Bruno, burned alive for suggesting the stars were other suns. Galileo, silenced for saying the earth moved. Even lesser-known figures, mathematicians, healers, visionaries, all punished for speaking too soon or seeing too clearly. The church didn't just oppose science, feared it, not because it threatened God, but because it threatened control. Every new discovery shifted the center of power. Every new theory challenged the idea that only the church held the keys to truth. Some of the files included transcripts of confessions, some given under pressure, some given under torture. They were cold, efficient, and final. Once branded a heretic, your fate was sealed. And centuries later, many of their ideas would turn out to be right. What scared me most wasn't just the past. It was how easily those structures still existed. The rituals, the silence, the quiet trials in forgotten rooms. Not every prison has bars. Some are built with rules and fear, and the promise that if you ask the wrong question, you'll never ask another. It started with a simple list. I was organizing old papal records for a senior archivist. Birth dates, death dates, and blessings of official decrees. It was supposed to be routine, just names on a page. But something felt off. Some names appeared in one book, but were missing in another. Some popes had no background, no origin, no trail, just a name and a title, as if they had appeared out of thin air, and then vanished the same way. At first I thought it was just sloppy record-keeping. After all, we were dealing with centuries of hand-copied documents. Mistakes happen. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it got. One name would have 3 different death dates. Another had miracles attributed to him, but no writings, no coins, no physical proof he ever existed. And yet, the church had listed him as a real pope for over 100 years. I found one especially strange case. A pope who supposedly ruled for 10 days, then was buried in secret. No reason given, no details. Just a brief mention in one document, and silence in all others. No tomb, no portrait, no proof. And still his name was repeated in official Vatican chronicles, as if that made him real. It was like tracing ghosts. I brought it up to a colleague. He told me in a low voice not to ask too many questions. That sometimes names are added to keep the timeline clean, to fill in gaps, to smooth out transitions of power. Especially during the early centuries, when politics and religion were so tangled together, you couldn't tell one from the other. But these weren't just gaps. These were entire lives invented to hold the structure in place. I started reading alternative histories, writings by scholars who had noticed the same things. They called them phantom popes, paper popes, figures who existed only in the records, but left no mark on the world. In some cases, there were even debates about whether certain popes were actually the same person under different names. And then there was the strange case of the female pope, Pope Joan, a legend denied by the church, but whispered in every corner of Europe. Some said she reigned disguised as a man. Others claimed she was a warning, a myth to scare or distract. But either way, her story pointed to one thing, that the papal record was not as flawless as it claimed. In an unbroken line from St. Peter to today, a golden chain of authority. But when you find weak links or links that never existed at all, the whole chain begins to tremble. The truth is, popes were human, chosen by men, not angels. And sometimes their names were written in for politics, for power, or just to cover up a missing year. I used to believe the papal record was history carved in stone. Now I know it is more like ink on water. And some names were never real, just echoes meant to keep the illusion alive. It was just another quiet morning in the archive. The kind where the only sound is the flick of old pages and the echo of footsteps on marble. I had been assigned to catalog a stack of uncategorized documents. Most were harmless sermons, drafts of papal letters, even old financial records. But near the bottom, I found something that didn't belong. No label, no seal, just a worn envelope with a single symbol pressed into the wax. Not the cross, not the papal crest. Something older, something I had never seen before. Inside was a document written in perfect Latin, but in a style that felt rushed and almost panicked. The handwriting changed halfway through, like more than one person had worked on it. The first few pages were confusing lines about astronomy timelines and celestial alignments. But then the tone shifted. It started talking about a recalibration of time itself. Dates moved, events reassigned, centuries blurred. It listed popes and emperors who were relocated on the timeline, as if history were a puzzle board being rearranged behind closed doors. Some events had been duplicated under different names in different regions. Others were completely fabricated to cover long stretches of silence. They called it necessary for the stability of the church, a correction for the faithful. My hands started shaking as I read. One section detailed how certain documents were to be altered before being placed in public archives, while the originals were to be sealed in the secret vault. It even had a list of the altered documents, with notes on what had been changed. Dates, names, locations, everything. But the worst part came near the end. A paragraph in red ink warned that if the truth ever surfaced, it would unravel not just church history, but the fabric of Western civilization. The idea of progress, the legitimacy of monarchies, even the credibility of science and astronomy. It said most would never believe it anyway, that the illusion was too strong, too deeply woven into culture, education, and memory. I didn't know what to do. I could pretend I hadn't seen it. I could report it and let it vanish again into the vaults. But something in me cracked. I thought about the students learning history from books that were carefully edited, about people shaping their faith around timelines that had been adjusted like theater scripts. I thought about everything I had already seen, the chained knowledge, the ghost pops, the missing saints. This was the last straw. I left the archive that day and never returned. I didn't pack. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked away. Because once you see the blueprint behind the illusion, you can't go back to pretending it's real. And maybe that's why they hide it. Not because the truth is too terrible, but because once you see it, you start asking questions. And that's what they fear the most. A world full of people who ask why. History is supposed to be a chain of events. One year leads to the next like footsteps across time. But what if some of those steps were faked? What if entire centuries were added on purpose? That idea sounds insane until you look closely at the cracks. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. They call it the phantom time hypothesis. The theory says that nearly 300 years of our calendar never actually happened, specifically from around 614 to 911 AD. That gap includes a whole bunch of events and rulers, including the early rise of the Holy Roman Empire. But according to this theory, those years were invented to make a lie look like the truth. At the center of it all are two names, Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Otto was a powerful emperor in medieval Europe, ambitious, smart, and obsessed with Rome's Golden Pass. He wanted to rule not just as a king, but as a Roman emperor. But there was a problem. He wasn't living in a time that matched that kind of title. So with the help of Pope Sylvester, they allegedly came up with a solution. Shift the timeline. Move the calendar forward. Insert a few hundred years. Make it look like Otto was ruling in the year 1000. A symbolic number. A holy number. A number that made his reign feel destined, powerful, chosen. This wasn't just about ego. It was about legitimacy. If Otto could link himself to the glory of Rome and claim divine timing, he would be more than just a king. He would be a myth. Pope Sylvester was no ordinary pope. Before taking the robe, he was a scientist, a mathematician, and possibly a magician if you believe some of the darker rumors. He understood astronomy, calendars, numbers. He would have known how to manipulate the system without anyone noticing. And back then, most people couldn't read. They didn't own calendars. Time was told by the church, by bells and feast days. So when the authorities said it was now the year 1000, people believed it. And history adjusted itself around the lie. But the evidence of the forgery is still there if you look. Archaeologists have noticed that there are very few reliable artifacts from that period. Architecture barely advanced. There are fewer records than you'd expect. It's like time slowed down or was filled in with recycled stories. Even some ancient manuscripts appear to repeat themselves. Same battles, different names, same kings in different places. Like someone copied and pasted old history to make new chapters. If this theory is true, then what we call the Middle Ages might be a carefully crafted illusion. A stage play written by men who wanted to control how the future would remember the past. And the church stood at the center of it. Not just recording time, but rewriting it. One date at a time. Once you see the gaps in the timeline, it doesn't feel like history anymore. It feels like a script, and someone long ago decided how the story should go. The stars don't lie. They rise and fall with precision that no empire can fake. Long before telescopes or charts, people used the sky to measure time, to plant, to travel, to remember. And when the church began rewriting history, the stars became a silent enemy. Because no matter how many scrolls you edit, the sky keeps perfect records. I first heard the term chronoastronomy in a hidden corner of the library. It was written in a dusty notebook left behind by a visiting scholar. It means using the stars to check historical dates. Things like eclipses and comets are predictable. We can run them backward in time with math and see exactly when they happen. So if an old text says there was a lunar eclipse on the night a king was crowned, we can check that. And if it doesn't match, something is wrong. The problem is, many of church's dates don't match. Some historians tried to speak up, quietly at first, then louder. They used astronomy to show that some major events may have been placed in the wrong century. That some popes and emperors might have lived at the same time, even though history says they were generations apart. These weren't just minor errors. There were deep cracks in the foundation of the calendar. But each time someone got close, they were pushed back. There was one astronomer I remember clearly, a brilliant man from Eastern Europe. He had built a computer model of the sky going back 2,000 years. He started comparing it to medieval texts and noticed dozens of inconsistencies. He gave a presentation in a small lecture hall, and a few weeks later, he vanished from the academic circuit. No one knows what happened. His work was pulled from the archives. His notes were deleted. Even his name started to fade from records. Another was a priest who had studied ancient star charts found in Egyptian temples. He believed they told a completely different version of time. one where events we call medieval may have actually happened much earlier or not at all. He tried to present his findings to the Vatican's Historical Council. They called it blasphemy and revoked his credentials. The Church's official line has always been that faith and science can coexist, but only when science doesn't question faith's timeline. The moment the stars begin to rewrite the script, silence falls like a curtain. Some say the Gregorian calendar reform was just a correction, a technical fix. But what if it was also a reset button, a way to bury the evidence that time had been tampered with? The stars are still up there, watching, waiting. They know the real story. They've seen every night pass without forgetting a single one. But the men who feared the stars feared something deeper. That truth doesn't need a pulpit, it just needs light. And the sky has never stopped shining. They couldn't silence the stars, so they silenced the people who listened to them. There is a room deep in the Vatican that smells like dust and leather and secrets. It isn't the archive most people talk about. It's older, quieter, and harder to find. You don't see it on any official map, which is strange because that room is filled with maps. Hundreds of them, maybe more, rolled up, locked in drawers, or mounted under glass. Maps that don't match what we were taught. I was only allowed in once under strict supervision. The man guiding me didn't speak much, just pointed and nodded. I was told to look but not take notes, not touch anything, not ask questions. The first thing I noticed were coastlines that didn't exist anymore. Islands drawn in the middle of oceans are now empty. Mountain ranges placed where there should be flat land. Entire continents shaped wrong. Some maps showed Antarctica without ice, with rivers and forests. Others had markings in the middle of the Atlantic that looked like cities. Names I had never heard of. Places that officially never existed. One map had a note in Latin scribbled in the corner. When I translated it later, it said, "Beware the lands that vanish." I saw maps that included civilizations we are told were never in contact. Trade routes that crossed impossible distances. Temples marked in places still unexplored today. The more I looked, the more I realized these weren't just artistic mistakes. They were windows into a version of Earth we are no longer allowed to believe in. Some of the maps were old copies of even older charts. You could see the layers of ink where different hands had tried to erase or correct certain names. But under the corrections, the truth was still there, waiting. There was one in particular I will never forget. A globe sketch from the early 1400s. It showed both Americas long before Columbus. Not as blank spaces, but with names of villages, rivers, and even symbols that looked like pyramids. When I pointed at it, the archivist shook his head and said that one is not for public eyes. Why would the Church keep maps that contradict its own version of history? Why lock them away instead of putting them in museums? Because maps are dangerous. They show you not just where you are, but where you've been. And if enough people see the old maps, they might start asking why the new ones lie. Cartography is not just science, it's power. Whoever controls the map controls the story. The borders, the names, the memory of what once was. The Vatican doesn't just guard theology, it guards geography. And in those forgotten drawers are the roads to places we've been told never existed, or that were destroyed. Or worse, that still exist but are hidden on purpose. Maps don't forget, they just wait to be read. And sometimes the scariest thing is not getting lost. It's finding out you were never where you thought you were. There's a strange pattern buried in the stories we're told. The deeper you dig into history, the more it feels like certain names were swapped. Inventors replaced by saints, experiments rewritten as miracles. Knowledge turned into myth, as if the past was edited, not erased, just rebranded. I first noticed it while studying the records of an early monastery known for healing. The scrolls described people recovering from sicknesses that should have killed them. Bones mended overnight, fevers broken with a touch. The local bishop called it the work of a saint. But in the margins, someone had scribbled notes in a different ink. Ingredients, temperatures, procedures. It read more like a medical journal than a divine event. Over time, I found more stories like that. A man who could purify water with crushed minerals, branded a saint after his death. But his journals talked about chemistry. A woman who taught villagers how to navigate using the stars, later turned into a mystical figure who simply followed divine signs. Her original maps vanished, only the prayers remained. It was like a switch, a deliberate choice to give the credit to heaven instead of human hands. When I asked an older priest about this, he smiled sadly. He told me the church didn't hate knowledge, it just feared what happened when knowledge outpaced faith. People start asking why, and when they stop needing blessings, they stop needing the ones who bless. So instead of banning the ideas completely, they gave them new clothes, wrapped science in robes, put halos on the curious, turned tools into relics. A gear becomes the wheel of a saint. A telescope becomes the eye of heaven. A book becomes a vision. One file I found told the story of a young man who created a device to measure rainfall and predict flooding. He was accused of heresy not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. The local leaders feared it would replace prayer, that people would trust machines over miracles. After his death, the church quietly canonized him, but called his invention a divine gift. The machine was hidden, and the story changed. This wasn't just about power, it was about control over memory. If you shape how people remember the past, you control how they imagine the future. A world where progress comes from prayer, not trial and error. Where innovation is divine, not dangerous. We think of saints as holy men and women who glowed with virtue, but maybe some of them were just brilliant thinkers, tinkerers, healers, observers of nature, silenced in life and worshipped in death. The truth is, the line between miracle and invention is thinner than we're taught. And sometimes the greatest miracle is that no knowledge survived at all. They didn't destroy the scientists, they turned them into saints. Because it's easier to worship what you don't understand than to admit someone figured it out before you. They looked harmless, heads bowed in prayer robes dragging across stone floors, hands stained with ink from copying scriptures. The monks of old were seen as peaceful, devoted, and silent. But what no one tells you is that some of them were also spies. Monasteries weren't just places of worship, they were information hubs. In a world where most people couldn't read, the monks were the ones who held the keys to knowledge. And with those keys came power. The kind of power that didn't need swords or armies, just silence and ink. Every monastery had a scriptorium, a room where texts were copied by hand. But not every text was copied faithfully. I found documents with entire paragraphs scratched out and entire pages replaced. A monk once confessed in an old letter that he was ordered to remove certain names from history, rewrite events, change dates, not because they were false, but because they didn't serve the church's version of truth. Monks traveled too, quietly, under the guise of pilgrimage or service, but they returned with more than just prayers. They brought news, gossip from courts, reports of strange teachings, warnings about heretics. They acted as the church's eyes and ears across the continent, long before governments had anything close to an intelligence network. If a village was building a strange machine, or a scholar was teaching ideas that didn't line up with doctrine, chances are a monk would hear about it first. Then the message would make its way up the chain. Sometimes the result was a quiet visit from a higher priest, sometimes a public trial, sometimes the records simply vanished. One chilling file I came across described a monastery near the coast that had received a book from a traveler. A text filled with knowledge about tides, wind patterns, and the movement of the moon. The abbot read it. I praised it, then I burned it. He wrote that such knowledge would lead people away from dependence on God, that it was better lost than learning. This wasn't just censorship, it was strategic memory control. There were also hidden rooms, secret vaults under certain monasteries where banned texts were kept were not destroyed, because while the public wasn't allowed to see them, the church still wanted to keep the information, just in case. It made me rethink everything I had ever believed about those quiet candlelit halls. The chants, the prayers, the gentle routine. Behind the peace was a network of surveillance. Behind the ink was a knife. And the most unsettling part is how effective it was. Entire revolutions of thought were stopped before they began. Not with violence, but with a whisper, a note, a missing page. The monks weren't just preserving history, they were shaping it, gatekeeping it, editing it. They didn't need to control armies, they controlled the past. And when you control the past, you shape the future. Not every monk was a spy, but enough were to make you wonder what was really hiding behind those walls, and how many truths were locked away in silence. Most people walk into cathedrals and see beauty. The stained glass, the high ceilings, the statues staring down like silent guardians. But I was taught to look deeper, not at what was shown, but at what was hidden. Because inside these stone giants are messages carved into silence, messages the church never talked about. It started when I visited a cathedral known for its strange architecture. Tourists came for the bells and the candles, but I kept noticing patterns. Geometric shapes tucked into arches, perfect ratios in window placements, and carvings that didn't match the official stories. Lions with human eyes, angels holding tools that looked like compass spiral symbols, echoing ancient knowledge of the stars. One statue in particular caught my attention. It was tucked away behind a pillar, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It showed a man with an open book, but the book wasn't the Bible. The letters were written in a forgotten language, and his eyes were closed as if guarding the knowledge rather than sharing it. Many cathedrals were built in the shape of a cross, but some had secret blueprints underneath. Labyrinths etched into the floor, measurements tied to the movements of planets. Builders who were more than just craftsmen. They were mathematicians, engineers, maybe even members of secret brotherhoods. People who encoded ideas that would have been burned if spoken out loud. Even the positioning of some cathedrals told a story. Aligned with solstices, eclipses, constellations. A kind of stone astronomy baked into the bones of the building. Why would a house of God need to align with the stars unless the builders knew something they weren't allowed to say? I remember one carving that kept me awake for days. It showed a tower being built, but halfway up it turned into a tree. The branches wrapped around a globe, and the globe had no cross on top. Instead, it had a compass. Below the carving, someone had etched the words, "Seek truth in silence." When I brought these things up to older priests, they brushed it off. Artistic choices, they said. Symbols of faith, they said. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to be afraid of it. The more I explored, the more it felt like the builders were trying to leave behind warnings, or maybe maps. Not of places, but of ideas. Hidden truths embedded in rock so they would outlast fire, censorship, and time. Cathedrals were supposed to teach the illiterate, but they didn't just teach scripture. They whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Not every message was about God. Some were about the stars, about knowledge, about power. The church tried to control words, but the stone doesn't burn. And when you start seeing these carvings not as decoration, but as defiance, you begin to wonder how much of our history was carved in rebellion, right beneath the eyes of faith. Europe is haunted, not by spirits or demons, but by machines. Traces of inventions that shouldn't exist. Ruins of systems that no one can explain. Tools buried in dust that feel too advanced for the time they came from. They call them anomalies. I call them mechanical ghosts. It started with an old monastery garden, overgrown and forgotten. But beneath the roots was a system of pipes and channels more complex than anything I had seen in medieval textbooks. It wasn't just a well or a simple aqueduct. It filtered water, cooled the air, and collected condensation. Almost like ancient air conditioning. But no one knew who built it. The current monks said it had always been there. Then I found sketches in the margins of a banned manuscript. Drawings of spinning gears, winding cranks, and moving parts. One looked like a mechanical clock. Another looked like a loom that could program patterns on its own. The date of the manuscript? Almost 300 years before those machines were supposed to exist. Later, I visited a church in France with a strange bell system. It rang every hour with perfect timing. But there were no ropes. No one is pulling. When I asked how it worked, the caretaker shrugged and said it had been broken for decades. When I snuck in to look, I found a wooden mechanism hidden behind a wall, weighed gears, levers. It had once powered itself using water from a nearby spring. Stories like this are everywhere if you know what to ask. Villagers who talk about ancient mills that could grind grain without touching them. Bridges made of stone so perfectly carved, they still haven't eroded. Locks so precise, they require keys that no blacksmith can replicate. Tools buried with craftsmen that contain alloys not found in that region until centuries later. Some say these were flukes, lucky inventions by geniuses lost to time. But too many of them were hidden, buried, destroyed, or worse, credited to divine miracles. One document I found spoke of a tower in Italy that once held a machine capable of mapping stars with incredible accuracy. The tower burned during a holy war, but survivors described cogs of bronze and glass lenses so powerful they could see ships on the horizon hours before they arrived. The church often called these creations dangerous, too close to magic, or worse, a challenge to God. Because if man could build wonders without divine permission, then what did that say about the church's authority? So they silenced the machines, not by smashing them, but by forgetting them, burying them beneath new buildings, removing their inventors from memory, calling their creations fables. But the ghosts remain in basements, in ruins, in texts no one reads anymore. They are the echoes of a Europe that was far smarter than we've been told. a continent that may have once hummed with gears and whispered with steam long before the industrial age ever began. We didn't evolve forward, we were pushed back, and the machines left behind are the proof. The first time I walked into a church-run classroom, I thought I was stepping into a place of light, a room built for learning truth-wisdom answers. But as the years passed, I realized it wasn't a place to explore, it was a place to forget. Not forget in the usual sense, not like losing your keys or misplacing a book. This was something deeper, designed, a kind of quiet erasing that worked from the inside out. The lessons were always the same. Scripture, memorization, strict timelines, lists of saints and sinners. Questions were allowed, but only the right kind. If you asked why God created the stars, you were praised. If you asked why those stars didn't match the church calendar, you were warned. I remember raising my hand once to ask why the Bible didn't mention certain ancient civilizations we knew existed. The teacher's smile faded. He told me some things were not meant to be questioned. He moved on. That was the beginning of the silence. Every book had missing pages. Every timeline had missing years. The maps were simplified. The thinkers praised were all the same. Augustine, Aquinas, a few safe poets, but no mention of the banned ones. No mention of the astronomers, the engineers, and the rebels. It wasn't just about what they taught, it was about how they taught it. Repetition over exploration, recitation over reasoning. You were rewarded for obedience, not curiosity. For silence, not wonder. There was a chart on the wall in one classroom I'll never forget. It showed the stages of sin. At the bottom, in small letters, one word stood out. Doubt. That was the core of it. Doubt was the enemy. Not just doubt in God. Doubt in anything official. Historical dates. Church leaders. Accepted facts. If you questioned the past, you were questioning the present. And if you questioned the present, you were drifting from salvation. Some of the older monks confessed to me later that they too had questions in their youth, but they buried them because questions got you reassigned or silenced or sent to a monastery so remote no one would ever hear from you again. I found hidden journals in one abandoned school, tucked behind a brick in the wall, pages filled with questions from students. What really happened to Hypatia? Why do the stars not match the feast days? Why are some saints never mentioned in older texts? Why were certain inventions never taught? None of those questions had answers, but they had something else. Scribbled in the corner by a different hand, maybe a priest, maybe a student, maybe someone who saw the truth. It read, "This place does not teach, it erases." And that's when I understood. The church didn't just rewrite history in books. I rewrote it in my mind. Year after year, generation after generation, until no one remembered what had been lost. The school of forgetting wasn't a myth. It was real. And most terrifying of all, it still is. Time feels simple. Days, months, years. One follows the other like footsteps in snow. But what if those footsteps were rearranged? What if the calendar we trust was built not to track time, but to control it? The Vatican didn't just shape faith, it shaped the clock. Most people don't think about calendars. We use them without question. But the shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar was more than just correcting leap years. It was a reset, a rewriting, a quiet deletion of days, and maybe more. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII announced the new calendar. The reason they gave was that Easter had drifted too far from the spring equinox, so they adjusted it. 10 whole days vanished. One day it was October 4th. The next day was October 15th. Just gone. People accepted it. They were told it was for accuracy. But imagine what else can be changed when no one questions lost time. 10 days this year, maybe 100 next century, maybe entire centuries rewritten and sealed in the vaults. When I studied old documents, I noticed strange patterns. Events that seemed out of sync. Letters referencing rulers who shouldn't have overlapped. Weather records that didn't match astronomical data. It was like the stars were telling one story and the church was telling another. Some scholars whisper about the phantom time hypothesis. The idea that hundreds of years were added to the calendar. That emperors and popes inserted themselves into history. That we are not in the year we think we are. One theory claims that Otto III and Pope Sylvester II collaborated to push the calendar forward, to place themselves in the year 1000. A symbolic act to claim power at the turn of a millennium that never actually happened. The more I looked into it, the more inconsistencies I found. Gaps in the historical record. Overlaps. Entire lifetimes missing from public archives. Calendars used in different parts of Europe that didn't align. And always the same response from church historians. Trust us, it was for your own good. But why would faith need to change time? Because time is power. If you can decide when things happened, you can decide what matters. You can make some stories seem ancient and untouchable. You can make others vanish entirely. Control the calendar and you control memory. When I brought this up to a former bishop, he didn't deny it. He just said the church has always done what is necessary to preserve truth. Then he smiled and added that sometimes truth requires sacrifice. I left that conversation feeling cold. Not because I was afraid of lost days, but because I was starting to see how deep the manipulation went. Not just of belief, but of reality itself. Time is the most sacred thing we share. And the Vatican turned it into a tool. A tool for rewriting history and burying what they didn't want the world to remember. There's a story the church tells over and over. A town on the brink of collapse saved by a saint's touch. A statue that cries real tears. A spring that bursts from dry earth after a prayer. They call it divine intervention. But what if some of those miracles weren't from heaven at all? What if they were machines? In one dusty archive, I found a map to a ruined monastery built into the side of a mountain. What made it famous was the story of a fountain that never ran dry. Even during droughts, the water flowed. Pilgrims called it a holy spring. The priest said it was a blessing from above. But when I finally visited what was left, I found stone channels carved beneath the ground and what looked like a system of valves. Primitive but brilliant water pressure regulator. Someone engineered that flow. It didn't need a miracle. It needed mathematics. Another time I read about a statue of a saint that bowed during Mass. It was considered proof of divine favor. Hundreds saw it happen. The church called it a sign. But hidden in a maintenance log from centuries later was a note scribbled in Latin. It described a set of internal gears powered by a rope and weight system hidden behind the altar. The mechanic who wrote it was proud. He said it was a marvel of craftsmanship. The kind that was quietly removed once the church changed its stance on magic. Throughout Europe, I found blueprints drawn in secret. Designs of towers that moved with the wind. Altars that lit up when certain prayers were spoken. Crosses that turned to face the sun at noon. Some were clever illusions. Others were real technology. Hydraulic power. Magnetism. Optics. But instead of celebrating the brilliance of the inventors, they were labeled as miracles. Then the inventors were either canonized or forgotten. There was power in the performance. If people believed that only saints or priests could bring about these wonders, it meant the church held the keys to the divine. Admitting that a mechanic or builder made the same thing with tools and know-how, that would mean heaven wasn't the source and faith would lose a little of its shine. I once asked an older priest about a rotating tabernacle I had seen in a forgotten chapel. He just smiled and said sometimes God works through clever hands, but his tone was careful, like he knew it was more than that, but didn't want to say it. Miracles inspired fear and awe. Machines invited questions, and questions were dangerous. So again and again the church chose the miracle. It buried the blueprints and raised the saints. It turned engineers into legends and inventions into blessings. And the world forgot that behind many of those sacred moments were wires, gears, levers, and minds far ahead of their time. Not every miracle was a lie, but not every miracle was holy either. Some were simply misunderstood science, dressed in robes and given a halo. People talk about the Renaissance like it was a lightning bolt, a sudden burst of genius after centuries of darkness. Art flourished. Science returned. Ideas exploded like fireworks. But what if it wasn't spontaneous at all? What if the Renaissance was planned? Not a discovery, but a release. A carefully timed awakening scripted by those who had been hiding the knowledge all along. When I studied inside the Vatican, I saw how many texts were locked away. Ancient works from Greece, Egypt, Persia, even lost civilizations that no one dared mention. These weren't hidden because they were evil. They were hidden because they were powerful. They spoke of medicine, architecture, astronomy, and math, far beyond what the church wanted people to know at the time. Then slowly around the 1000, for hundreds that knowledge began to resurface. But not all at once. Carefully in stages. A scroll here, a manuscript there. Copied, translated, and passed to trusted scholars. Artists started painting with strange symbols. Scientists began observing the sky again, but none of it felt random. It was as if someone opened the vault, just enough to let a few ideas slip out. Enough to light the match, but not enough to burn the whole system down. I found letters between cardinals and early thinkers. They talked about managing the flood of ideas, making sure that discoveries were attributed to safe figures, that the church could still claim to guide the awakening. They called it divine timing, but it was a strategy. Even the artists of the Renaissance were part of this script. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. They weren't just painters. They were initiated. Some of their works hid geometry and ancient codes that pointed to older systems of thought. Their art was like a puzzle, truth hidden in beauty. One fresco I studied had a spiral hidden in the clouds. That spiral matched the layout of a forbidden book I saw once behind locked glass. A book that mapped the stars in ways no one was supposed to know until centuries later. Coincidence? I doubt it. The Renaissance gave people the illusion of progress, but it progressed with a leash. Discoveries had to be church-approved. Books had to be filtered. Ideas too dangerous were delayed or erased, and those who pushed too far, too fast, were silenced. Galileo saw this firsthand. Praised one year, imprisoned the next. Not because he was wrong, but because he said it before they were ready. The more I learned, the more it felt like the past had never really been lost. It had been stored, locked up, and then handed back when the world was desperate enough to accept it without asking where it had been. The Renaissance was a beautiful moment in history, but beauty can be a mask. Underneath the light was a shadow, a hand guiding what we remembered and what we forgot. It wasn't an awakening. It was a reveal, and the script had been written long before the curtain ever rose. Not all flames die in the dark. Some are hidden, carried in silence from one hand to the next across generations. While the Vatican tried to lock the truth away, others worked quietly to protect it. They weren't priests or popes. They were builders, stargazers, philosophers, and alchemists. They were the secret keepers, and their mission was simple: keep the light alive. They called themselves many names: Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Knights of the Temple. To the outside world, they looked like clubs or cults, but inside their symbols told a different story. Geometry, sacred number, stars that pointed to ancient truths. While the Church wrote saints into the heavens, these groups wrote equations on hidden scrolls and carved messages into stone. I once saw a cathedral blueprint from the 13th century filled with strange symbols. Compass shapes are not tied to scripture, but to stargates. Ratios that matched the human body and distant planets. It wasn't just built for worship. It was built to encode knowledge. A silent rebellion in stone. In one dusty cellar beneath a former monastery, I found a copy of a book the Vatican had claimed was lost. An alchemical text with gold ink that shimmered like starlight. It spoke of the transformation of light hidden in matter. The priest who had owned it had scribbled a warning in the margin. They tried to burn it. I made a copy. Pass it forward. The Rosicrucians were said to possess ancient Egyptian knowledge. Hidden chambers, libraries buried under the sands. When explorers returned from the Middle East during the Crusades, some didn't come back with relics. They came back with blueprints. Secrets the Church couldn't translate or dared not to. The Freemasons were builders, but also philosophers. They studied Solomon's temple not just as a biblical structure, but as a code, a map. They believed truth was hidden in structure, in symmetry, in light itself. They didn't preach it. They embedded it in lodges, in architecture, in the layout of entire cities. The Church accused them of heresy, of conspiracy, but rarely lies. Because deep down the Church knew what these groups were preserving. Not fairy tales, not rebellion. Memory. Even alchemists, the ones mocked as dreamers searching to turn lead into gold, weren't after riches. Many were after something older, a return of lost wisdom, a way to unlock what had been sealed. I once met an old man in Portugal who claimed to be part of an unbroken line of guardians. He showed me a ring with a symbol older than any cross, a compass within a flame. He said, "We don't fight them. We wait. The truth always returns. It just needs a place to land." That's what these groups were. Landing pads for forgotten truths. While the Vatican erased them, they remembered. While the Church burned, they preserved. They were the return of the light. And though they were hunted, silenced, and scattered, their flame never went out. It just went underground. And now maybe it's beginning to rise again. It's one of the most guarded rooms on earth. Not because it holds gold or jewels, but because it holds something far more powerful. Memory, truth, and maybe even the pieces of time itself. They call it the Vatican Secret Archives. But that name is a trick. It's not just a secret. It's hidden, sealed, and the world has only seen a fraction of what lies beneath. The entrance is nothing special. A stone hallway, a steel door, a badge scanner. But past that door are over 50 miles of shelves. 50 miles underground. Lit by flickering lamps and lined with texts no one outside the church has read in hundreds of years. Some in languages no longer spoken. Some written in symbols. Some with covers that seem to hum when touched. I remember the first time I caught a glimpse of the index. It was handwritten. A red leather binder, no thicker than a dictionary. But the entries inside didn't read like normal books. They were warnings. Scrolls from before the flood. Banned gospels. Testimonies from heretics whose names never made it into history books. Blueprints of machines drawn centuries before those technologies should have existed. There was even one note that simply read, "Do not touch unless approved by the Holy Office. Contents unstable. Unstable knowledge." Think about that. Words so dangerous they need to be locked away. Not because of what they are, but because of what they could do. Shift belief. Rewrite history. Prove we are not who we think we are. There are rumors of letters from Leonardo da Vinci describing flight. Not imagination. Function. Angle. Lift. Like he had already seen machines that would not exist for 500 more years. There are whispers of maps showing continents that do not appear on modern globes. Of charts that trace the stars in ways that do not match our current models. Calendars from civilizations wiped out by time or something worse. One former archivist who disappeared in the 90s claimed he saw a scroll sealed in black wax. Inside were symbols etched in gold leaf. Not Latin. Not Greek. Something older. A language of geometry. He said when he looked at it too long, it felt like it was looking back. The church says the archives are restricted to protect the fragile documents. To guard the truth until it is safe to share. But how long is safe? 100 years? 1,000? Or is it never? Because if even half of what's listed in those shelves is real, then everything we know about human history changes. The wars, religions, the inventions, the timelines, all of it. The hidden vault isn't just a place. It's a boundary between the world we know and the one that was stolen from us. And the scariest part isn't what's in it. It's the fact that we may never be allowed to see it. Not because we can't understand, but because we might understand too well. There's a version of the Bible most people never get to see. Not because it's lost or broken, but because it was buried on purpose. Pages ripped out, names erased, and teachings that could have changed everything hidden beneath layers of fear and fire. They called them heresies, but they were something else. A different voice, a different story, a truth too raw for the empire of the church to allow. These were the gospels they tried to burn. One of the most mysterious is the Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't read like the others. There's no birth story, no crucifixion, just sayings. Words straight from the mouth of Jesus. But the tone is different, personal, like he was speaking not to crowds but to seekers. One line stands out more than any. The kingdom is within you. That idea alone could undo centuries of control. If the divine is inside you, why do you need a priest? Then there's the Gospel of Mary. Not just Mary the mother, but Mary Magdalene. The one who was rewritten as a prostitute to strip her of power. But in this gospel, she is the one who truly understands Jesus. The one he trusts. the one the other disciples fear because her wisdom threatens their authority. In the eyes of this text, she was not just a follower. She was a teacher, maybe even more than that. When I first found copies of these Gospels in a locked drawer deep in the archives, I wasn't supposed to open. I felt like I had uncovered a crime scene. The pages were scorched at the edges, like someone had tried to destroy them and change their mind at the last second. The Latin labels didn't match the content. It was like they were trying to hide them even from themselves. There are others too. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Egyptians, texts that hint at entirely different versions of the story. Some say Jesus laughed during his betrayal. Others say he never died at all. Some speak of a spiritual resurrection, not a physical one. All of them were banned. All of them hunted. Because if people believed these stories, it would mean the church's foundation wasn't made of stone. It was made of silence. You have to ask yourself why. Why go through so much effort to erase words? Why burn scrolls and bury libraries and rewrite names? If the official version is the truth, why fear the rest? The answer is simple. Control. The banned Gospels empowered the individual. They made the divine something personal, not hierarchical. They made God a whisper, not a throne. And that terrified those who built their empire on obedience. The gospel they tried to burn still lives in fragments, in whispers, in the quiet spaces between the official lines. And maybe that's enough, because once a truth has been written, it can never be fully erased. Only delayed, only feared, and eventually rediscovered. There was a time when asking questions could get you killed. Not violent questions or political ones. Just simple things. Why do the stars move? What is the body made of? Where does lightning come from? In an age ruled by the church, even curiosity was dangerous. It was not encouraged. It was feared, because curiosity opens doors. And the Vatican spent centuries making sure some doors stayed shut. Imagine a world where books were locked in chains, where reading the wrong thing meant torture, where drawing the solar system differently could cost you your freedom. That was not fantasy. That was Europe for hundreds of years. I remember reading an old letter buried in the archive. It was from a monk in the 1400s who had been caught experimenting with lenses to magnify tiny insects. The letter was short. They have taken my tools. I am not allowed to see what God has made without permission. That one line broke me. He wasn't even defying doctrine. He was just trying to look closer. But even that was seen as rebellion. The church claimed to protect truth, but in reality it controlled it. Scientists who discovered things that contradicted Scripture were forced to retract their findings or face brutal punishment. Galileo was forced to deny what he saw with his own eyes. Not because he was wrong, but because he was early. Because the world was not ready for the sky to contradict the Bible. Philosophers too were hunted. Men who questioned the nature of reality of the soul of time itself were labeled heretics. Some were imprisoned. Some were burned. Others simply vanished. Their books disappeared. Their names scratched out from records. And it wasn't just about religion. It was about power. If people started to think for themselves, to explore, to question, they might realize that the church was not the only path to knowledge. That scared those in charge more than anything. I once held a banned book on anatomy. It showed muscle, bones, and veins. It had been copied in secret by students who risked their lives just to understand how the human body worked. There were blood stains on the pages, not from the drawings, from the people who had died to protect them. You might think that was all long ago, but even today echoes of that fear remain. Certain books are still restricted. Certain questions are still silenced. The war against curiosity never fully ended. It just changed form. The truth is, the church was never just fighting science. It was a fighting wonder, that spark in the human soul that refuses to settle for easy answers, that hunger to understand. When curiosity became a crime, knowledge became contraband, and history was shaped not by what we learned, but by what we were never allowed to ask. But questions are stubborn things. You can bury them, but sooner or later they rise. And when they do, everything changes. It didn't start with torture. It started with doubt. Quiet warnings whispered in church halls. Looks exchanged across candlelit rooms. A slow creeping fear that grew not from violence, but from the possibility of it. That if you thought the wrong thing, or read the wrong words, or even dreamed too far outside the lines, you could be accused. Not of evil, but of heresy. And in those days, heresy was worse than crime. It was a crack in the perfect wall, a danger to the illusion. The Inquisition didn't just go after witches or rebels. It went after thinkers, artists, healers, astronomers. People who dared to imagine a world that didn't fit the narrow script approved by Rome. Their tools weren't just racks and flames. They used silence. They used shame. They turned neighbors into spies, students into snitches, families into witnesses. I remember reading a transcript of a young woman's trial. She had asked in confession if animals had souls. Just asked. The priest reported her. She was taken, interrogated, accused of having unnatural thoughts. Her entire life unraveled from a single question. That is how fragile reason became. Not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. Schools began to teach obedience over thought. Stories replaced science. Saints replaced scholars. Wonder was labeled temptation. And so, over time, the mind bent inward. Not out of stupidity, out of survival. It was safer to believe than to doubt. Safer to repeat than to explore. Safer to fear the unknown than to reach for it. Generations grew up inside that cage, not even knowing it was a cage. That's the cruelest part. When the bars are made of tradition and the lock is made of guilt, you don't even try the door. You learn to sit quietly, to pray when you want to ask, to obey when you want to build. I once saw a book of inventions designed centuries ahead of their time. Gears that could move entire cities. Ideas for clean water systems, for flight, for light without flame. All sketched out in secret, all hidden in walls behind altars, because their creators knew they would be burned before their machines ever moved. The Inquisition didn't just torture bodies. It broke my imagination. It rewrote what was acceptable to feel. And when you train enough minds to fear their own thoughts, you don't need chains anymore. The prison lives inside. But thought is patient. And some people kept the old ideas alive. In code, in carvings, in paintings that seemed religious, but carried messages only the curious could see. The mind can be silenced, but not forever. And every time someone remembers to ask why that silence cracks just a little, until one day the questions flood back in, and the world begins to think again. Not because permission was given, but because fear finally ran out of power. They didn't wear crowns. They didn't lead armies. They didn't march into cities waving flags, but they conquered more than empires ever could. They shaped minds, controlled memory, bent history itself to their design. They were the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and their empire wasn't built on land. It was built in silence. At first, they looked like just another religious order. Educated, disciplined, devoted. But beneath the robes and rituals was something more calculated. A strategy, a system, one that understood the true battlefield wasn't out in the world. It was inside the classroom, inside the courtroom, inside the mind. I remember the first time I saw the chart, a hand-drawn map from a dusty drawer in the archives. It didn't mark countries. It marked an influence. Universities, royal advisors, publishing houses, political confessions. Every dot was a place where a Jesuit had once served, or still did. It looked less like a religious mission and more like a spider web wrapped around Europe. They started with schools, not just any schools, the best ones. They trained princes, taught diplomats, wrote the textbooks. If you learned Latin, math, philosophy, or theology in the 1600s, chances are you learned it from a Jesuit. And with every lesson came something else. A subtle shaping, a narrowing of possibility. You didn't just learn facts. You learned how to think and, more importantly, how not to. Then came the courts, not as lawyers, as confessors, spiritual advisors to kings, queens, and generals, whispering behind thrones, offering guidance in the name of God, but also in the name of policy. The Jesuits weren't just men of faith. They were men of strategy. They kept records, tracked secrets, knew who owed what to whom. Some historians say they knew of battles before the armies did, and that they could stop wars with a letter or start them with a rumor. Governments took notice. Some feared them. Others welcomed them. Some countries even banned them outright. But even exile couldn't stop the mission. They went underground, changed names, continued the work, always teaching, always guiding, always watching. One document I found simply said, "The pen is the greatest sword." It was unsigned, but I know it was Jesuit, because their true power was never about force. It was about formation. You don't need to fight a king if you teach his son. You don't need to burn books if you write them first. People still see the Jesuits as a religious group, and they are. But they are also architects of thought, engineers of memory, guardians of a version of history that serves something far deeper than faith. Their empire was never loud, never flashy, but it was vast. And it is still here, in the way schools teach, in the way courts justify, in this way governments speak of truth and tradition. It is a quiet empire, but silence has always been their sharpest weapon. Most people think of time as something fixed, a sunrise, a calendar, ticking clock. But what if time wasn't just something we follow, but something we're led through, like a hallway built to control where we go and what we see? That hallway has a designer, and for centuries that designer was the church. They didn't invent time, but they shaped it, bent it, cut it, hide pieces, added others, all to create a version of history that fit the story they wanted to tell. If you control the past, you control the present. And if you shape the future before it arrives, you control what people believe is possible. One day in the archives, I found a small box labeled only with a date. Inside were letters between priests and astronomers. They were trying to align the calendar with the stars, but not in the way scientists would. This wasn't about accuracy. It was about power. They were deciding when holy days should fall, not based on actual events, but on symbolism, on messaging, on control. Easter, for example. The date changes every year. Why? Because it's tied to a lunar calendar, the full moon after the spring equinox. That sounds poetic, but it's also strategic. It keeps the most important Christian event floating, shifting impossible to pin to any one historical moment. That means the resurrection becomes a feeling, not a fact. And feelings are easier to guide than facts. Then there's the shift from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian. On paper, it was just about fixing leap years. But 10 days vanished overnight. People woke up, and it was suddenly 10 days later. Whole lives lost in a bureaucratic rewrite of time. And who led that change? Pope Gregory XIII. The Church didn't just change the calendar. They rewrote reality. Prophecies, too, were timed carefully. Predictions of apocalypse, Messiah signs in the sky, all aligned to dates the Church approved. If something didn't fit the official narrative, it was called heresy and erased. But if a new star appeared, or a comet crossed the heavens, and it could be tied to a verse in Scripture, it became a tool. A way to keep believers alert, obedient, and afraid. Control of time meant control of memory. And memory is everything. It's how we build identity, how we understand where we come from, and what's ahead. If someone else holds the clock and the calendar and the prophecy, they hold your story. And if they hold your story, they can make you believe almost anything. The Church became timekeepers, not just of hours and minutes, but of centuries and destinies. They told us when history began and when it would end. And in doing so, they became more than a religion. They became the authors of time itself. And the deeper you look, the more you realize time is not just passing by. It is being told, chapter by chapter, by hands older than we ever imagined. It's easy to walk through a cathedral and only see beauty. The soaring arches of the stained glass, the perfect balance of light and shadow. But what if that beauty was more than decoration? What if it was a message, a hidden code carved in stone, waiting for someone to notice? Not written in words, but in shapes, numbers, patterns. The architects knew what they were doing. They weren't just building churches, they were building vaults of knowledge. I remember staring up at the ceiling of an old basilica in southern France. Something felt off, not wrong, just too perfect. The symmetry angles the way sunlight hits the altar exactly at noon on a certain day of the year. It didn't feel random, it felt planned. And when I looked closer, I saw it. The repetition of circles and triangles. Ratios that matched star maps. The golden spiral hidden in the layout of the nave. This wasn't art, it was information. Sacred geometry is the idea that certain shapes hold meaning. That the universe itself follows patterns. The circle for eternity. The triangle for balance. The square for foundation. These weren't just symbols, they were tools. And medieval architects used them like priests used scripture. To preserve truths too dangerous to say out loud. You see, when words were banned, when books were burned, when curiosity was punished, the builders turned to math. Geometry became their language, and they hid it in plain sight behind the altars, beneath towers. In the floor plans of monasteries, they encoded ancient truths into the very stones the church stood on. One chapel I visited had a hidden diagram etched under a layer of plaster. When cleaned, it revealed a full map of constellations, perfectly aligned with the architecture. The church had covered it centuries ago, probably didn't even realize what it was. But the original builders knew they were passing on a message about time, about the stars, about something the Vatican didn't want remembered. Some cathedrals were even designed to resonate with sound at certain frequencies. Not by accident, by calculation. Tones that matched old musical scales, tied to healing, to meditation, to altered states of awareness. The builders knew what the priests didn't. Or maybe the priests knew too and chose to silence it. It makes you wonder how much has been lost, or worse, how much has been buried on purpose. Because if the shape of a window can point to a forgotten planet, or the path of a hallway can mirror a sacred equation, then the church is standing on a puzzle it never solved, or pretended not to. The architects couldn't speak openly, but they built with intention. Every line, every angle, every stone was part of a message. And they left that message not for kings or cardinals, but for the future. For the ones who would one day ask why this place feels different. Why does it hum with something older than faith? Because some truths can't be shouted. They must be carved, whispered in math, and stone, and silent. And they are still waiting to be read. There is the church that everyone sees. The one with balconies, and blessings, and bells that echo across city rooftops. The one that holds ceremonies in the open, and makes statements in front of cameras. But behind that curtain, some say there is another church. One that doesn't speak to the public. One that doesn't answer to the Pope. A hidden hierarchy beneath the surface, pulling strings with quiet precision. They call it the church beneath the church. I first heard whispers of it from an old scholar in Rome. He wouldn't speak the names out loud, but he showed me symbols carved into places no visitor was ever supposed to see. Strange insignias on library walls. Seals on envelopes that never went through normal channels. He said if the Vatican was a stage, then this was backstage. The control room. The quiet eye watching everything. This secret structure isn't written in public documents. You won't find it in Vatican directories or annual reports, but the signs are there. Decisions made without explanation. Priests who rise to power with no visible history. Entire projects launched and then buried without a trace. Someone is making those calls. But it's not always the man in white. There are rumors of a council. Not cardinals. Not bishops. Something older. Something quieter. Men who wear no robes, but who carry centuries of knowledge and access. People say they meet in the sub-basements of Vatican City. Rooms without names. Corridors that lead to vaults, guarded not just by locks, but by silence. One night in the archives, I stumbled on a restricted journal. It spoke of a place called the Black Room. No details, just that it was below the level where official records end. A priest had been assigned to clean near it once. He wrote only this. I heard voices behind the stone. They knew I was listening. Even the Pope is not immune to this shadow. Some believe he is briefed but not fully included. That he serves as the face, while others shape the flow of money, politics, doctrine, and memory. This would explain why popes sometimes speak of reform, but then go quiet. Why questions get asked but never answered. Why history keeps repeating in patterns too controlled to be random. The church beneath the church does not seek followers. It seeks order, preservation, control over what is remembered and what is erased. It does not need prayers or parades, only obedience and silence. If this hidden power structure is real, it changes everything. It means the Vatican is not just a religious institution, it's a mask. And behind that mask are forces that have shaped kings, toppled empires, and rewritten centuries without ever stepping into the light. And maybe the scariest part is this. If the church beneath the church exists, we were never supposed to know. Which makes you wonder what else it is hiding, and how deep the truth really goes. Some years leave a mark, wars start, kings fall, comets blaze across the sky. But then there are years that feel too quiet, too smooth, like pages added to a story that no one remembers reading. These aren't just empty years. Some believe they never happened at all. Welcome to the theory of the year that never was. It started with a question. Why does it feel like certain centuries left no trace behind? From around 614 to 911 AD, the world seems strangely blank. Few records, no major discoveries, no lasting buildings. Whole generations passed with almost nothing to show for it. Historians call it the Dark Ages. But what if that darkness was artificial? What if someone turned off the lights on purpose? This is where the phantom time hypothesis comes in. A theory that about 300 years of history was simply invented, not lost, not forgotten, forged, fabricated by powerful rulers who wanted to rewrite their place in time. The main suspects are Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Pope Sylvester II. Together they had the means, the motive, and the tools to change the calendar itself. According to the theory, Otto wanted to rule in the year 1000, a year of prophecy and rebirth. But he was born too early. So instead of waiting, he adjusted the dates, added years, moved events. Suddenly his reign aligned perfectly with the millennium, and the church helped seal it. After all, if time was being rewritten by the faithful, it must be divine right. The Julian and Gregorian calendars give this theory fuel. When the switch happened in 1582, 10 days were erased to fix drift. But some say the correction should have been much larger, as if the missing time was never real to begin with. Astronomy backs it up. Recorded eclipses don't always match where they should fall. Stars seem off by centuries. It's like the sky remembers something we don't. Even certain rulers feel like ghosts. Charlemagne, for example, his empire was massive. His legend is even bigger. But the actual evidence for his life is strange. Most of what we know comes from documents written long after he supposedly died. Statues, books, and coins all seem too clean, too perfect, as if they were made to fill in the blanks. Of course, mainstream historians reject this. They say the theory is flawed, that human error and lost records explain the gaps. But still, the feeling lingers. That history is full of placeholders. Years we learnt about but never really felt. Rulers we're told to admire, but who left no fingerprints behind. The idea that time could be forged is terrifying. Because if you can fake the past, you can control the future. You decide what came before, who mattered, what was forgotten. You shape reality itself. And maybe that's why the church was involved. Not just to bless the lie, but to protect it. Because once you admit time can be edited, you have to ask what else has been rewritten. And how much of what we know was never real at all. It was small. Just a folded piece of pages of an unrelated manuscript. No seal, no label, no reason it should have survived. But it did. And when the priest opened it, he knew instantly this wasn't supposed to exist. The ink was faded, but the language was sharp. A mix of Latin and a dialect used only by scribes deep inside the Vatican. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a confession. It was a directive, a set of instructions dated over 800 years ago. And at the bottom, a name that should not have been there. A name tied to a council that history claims never took place. The document outlined the deliberate destruction of certain texts, not heretical writings, not pagan rituals, but early versions of Scripture itself, gospel fragments, astronomical records, treatises on healing and sound and light. The list went on. Some had already vanished from every known archive. Others had never been catalogued to begin with. It was as if someone had designed a vacuum in time and memory, and here it was laid out in neat, careful handwriting. What struck the priest most was the tone. It wasn't panicked or harsh. It was calm, methodical, as if removing knowledge was just another part of church maintenance, like sweeping the floors or mending robes. There was no apology, just a single closing line. The faithful must not remember what never served the faith. For days the priest sat with the document. He reread it, cross-referenced names, dates, phrases. One location appeared twice. A sealed chamber beneath a basilica in Ravenna. Officially it was just a crypt, unused and unremarkable. But an old map showed something more. A second floor below the crypt. No stairs. No access. As if it had been built and buried all in the same century. That was the moment he broke. He had accepted silence for years. Made peace with mysteries. Even looked the other way when he found books with missing chapters and shelves that changed overnight. But this was different. This was proof that there was a plan, that forgetting had been scheduled like Mass. He knew he couldn't keep it, so he copied the document by hand. Not digitally, not scanned. Ink on parchment like the original. He stored the copy somewhere no one would expect. A place not even the church would think to look. And the original? He burned it, not out of fear, but to erase his trail. To make sure they wouldn't trace the leak back to him. What it implied was simple and devastating. That memory had been weaponized. That forgetting was not a flaw of history, but a function of control. And the church wasn't just a keeper of the sacred. It was a curator of reality, selecting what remained and quietly erasing what did not. The seal had been broken, and for the first time he wasn't just a priest. He was a witness, and that made him dangerous. There are things the church still fears. Not bombs or protests or angry letters, but questions. Old questions that never got answers. Questions that pull at threads they worked for centuries to bury. Not because they don't know the answers, but because they do. The truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits in silence. In locked drawers. In crumbling scrolls. With names no one says out loud. And the biggest secret isn't about angels or demons or even Jesus. It's about time, about who wrote the story we all live inside, and what they left out on purpose. If people found out that entire centuries were forged, that calendars were adjusted to create a prophecy, or that the stars we see don't match the dates we're told, the illusion would collapse. If they saw how science was swapped for miracles, and how entire civilizations were painted over by saints, the cracks would be too big to hide. They fear the Gospel of Thomas because it says the kingdom of God is already here. They fear Mary Magdalene because she wasn't just a follower. She was a teacher. They fear old maps that show continents that no longer exist, and machines that predate the church by thousands of years. Not because these things are evil, but because they prove we've been lied to. The illusion works because it feels complete. You grow up learning that history is settled, that the past is a straight line, but it's not. It's full of edits, blanks, substitutions. And behind each change is a motive, control. Because if you control the past, you decide who matters now. You decide what people can dream about tomorrow. What they still fear most is curiosity. Real curiosity. The kind that doesn't stop at Sunday school answers or dusty textbooks. The kind that reads banned books and asks why this chapter is missing. The kind that looks at the stars and wonders why they don't match the church's calendar. The kind that hears silence and listens closer. They fear the return of forgotten names. Names that once opened doors and healed bodies and moved stone with sound. They fear someone walking into a cathedral and realizing the carvings aren't just decoration. They're instructions. They fear that once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. That memory will wake up and not go back to sleep. This isn't about destroying faith. It's about freeing it. About lifting the veil and letting people choose what to believe with their eyes wide open. Because faith built on fear isn't faith. It's control. So if you've made it this far, you already feel it. That itch in the back of your mind. That sense that something doesn't add up. Don't ignore it. Follow it. Question everything. Because the greatest fear of those in power is not rebellion. It's remembrance. And sometimes remembering is the most dangerous thing you can do. But it's also the most important. The story they told us was always the same. That the light faded. That darkness fell over the world. That people forgot how to think. How to build. How to dream. They called it the Dark Ages. Like the world itself went blind. But maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe the light wasn't lost. Maybe it was hidden. There are sparks still glowing under centuries of dust. Not just in books or ruins, but in you. In the questions that won't leave you alone. In the quiet moments when something doesn't feel right. When the story sounds too clean, too neat, too edited. The truth is not gone. The scattered, locked in vaults, coded in stone. Whispers passed down through paintings, blueprints, cathedrals, and myths. The flame never died. They just built walls around it. And now those walls are starting to crack. You don't need permission to ask questions. You don't need a collar, a degree, or a blessing to wonder what came before. You just need to care enough to look, to read between the lines, to notice what's missing, because what they erased still echoes. The pages they burned still have shadows, and memory has a way of finding its way back. This journey was never about hate or revenge. It was about remembering, reclaiming, looking at the world not as they want you to see it, but as it really is. A place filled with knowledge that never belonged to one group. A planet where truth doesn't bow to titles or robes. And maybe the greatest secret isn't in some hidden archive under the Vatican. Maybe it's in the fact that you were never meant to forget. That deep down you always knew something was wrong. That all those so-called heresies and banned gospels and missing centuries aren't just mistakes. They're signs, clues, warnings that truth isn't what we're handed. It's what we uncover. The light was never lost. It was buried under fear, obedience, and silence. But you're here now, and that means something. It means you're willing to see, willing to feel the discomfort that comes with knowing you've been lied to, willing to ask what else they tried to keep from you. And you're not alone. There are others, quiet voices rising, artists, dreamers, ex-priests, historians, rebels, people digging into the past not to break it but to free it, people who believe that light belongs to everyone, not just the chosen few. So carry it, pass it on, protect it when they try to smother it again, because they will. But this time it's different. This time we remember, and that changes everything. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.